The house had been filled with music and light and gaiety, and had taken on a fairy tale magic. It had been well after 2 o'clock in the morning when the party finished and the guests dispersed, those who were staying overnight disappearing upstairs to their suites, and the rest taking their leave in the multitude of motor cars and carriages outside. Almost immediately, the long row of bells in the kitchen had started tinkling as the guests demanded attention. Hot water for the hip baths in each suite, refills for the stone hot water bottles which had been placed in beds earlier that evening, hot chocolate for the ladies and brandy for the men, and so on. The Richmonds were unusually considerate employers and rarely called on their staff after dinner in the evenings, apart from Lord Richmond's valet and his wife's lady's maid. But that night the footman and the maids were sent hurrying hither and thither. She had been sent to a suite at the end of a long corridor in the west wing, with a tray holding a cup of hot chocolate, dainty iced biscuits, and a glass of brandy for the occupants. She had knocked at the door, and when a voice had bidden her come in, she had nearly dropped the tray as a middle-aged man in a state of undress casually told her to put it on a side table, slurring his words as he spoke. She had placed the tray where he said, bobbing a curtsy as she had straightened and turned to face him. "Pretty little thing, aren't you?" He had moved to stand between her and the door, and as she'd smiled nervously, he'd added, "Doesn't look as though my wife will want her chocolate. She's dead to the world," waving his hand across the room to the big double bed where the sound of genteel snores could be heard. When he had reached out a hand and pushed it into the dressing room behind her, shutting the door as he had followed, she had been too surprised to react for a moment, and then, as she realised what he was about, she'd opened her mouth to scream, only for him to grab her and put his hand over it. He'd been a big man and broad with it, and at 5 foot and slender as a reed, she'd had no chance to prevent what had followed. The rape had been short and brutal, her muffled protestations against the iron hand clamped over her mouth and her struggling, both futile. When he'd expended himself, he'd dragged her back into the bedroom, obscenely unbuttoned and still with his hand smothering her sobs, reaching for some coins scattered on the dressing table. "Here." He had fumbled for the pocket of her uniform and thrust the money inside. "Our little secret, eh? That's a good girl." And with that, he had pulled her across the room and shoved her outside into the dark corridor, shutting the door. She had stood, shaking and crying quietly, unable to take in the enormity of what had just occurred, the pain and smarting between her legs, proof it was real. She'd reached the end of the corridor and was on her way downstairs to tell Mrs. Finnegan, the housekeeper, what he had done to her, when Beatty, the other upstairs maid, met her. "What's up? You been crying?" Still in shock, she had mumbled what had happened and that she had to see Mrs. Finnegan. But Beatty, 2 years older and wiser to the ways of the gentry, had shook her head. "You do that, and you'll be out on your ear afore you can say Jack be nimble," she'd whispered darkly. "It'll be your word against his, and guess who they'll believe? He'll either say you're making it up and you pinched the money when he wasn't looking, or that you offered yourself to him on a plate and being in his cups he was tempted. Either way, your reputation will be ruined. That's Colonel Hewitt and his wife in that room, and they're great friends of the family." She had put her hand on Sophia's arm, her voice matter-of-fact but not unkind, as she'd added, "It's done now, lass, and if nowt else it'll teach you to be more careful in the future. I've met the odd beggar like him, and bringing your knee up where it hurts always works for me. Come on. Mrs. Finnegan said we could go to bed once we'd taken the trays, and everything'll seem better in the morning." She had taken Beatty's advice, but for the rest of that night had lain awake in the women's servants' quarters beyond the kitchen and scullery and dairy, crying softly and in pain from his handling of her. And the next morning, nothing had seemed better. Deep in the drift, she was sheltered from the bitter northeast wind that gusted above and sent the snowflakes whirling in a frenzied dance, her breath slowing as she fell more deeply asleep. Now she was transported back to the life she'd endured before the big house, to the miserable existence in the workhouse. She had been 6 years old when she had entered its austere surroundings after the death of her Italian parents. They had died from cholera in a record heatwave that had swept the country shortly after the 3 of them had arrived in Newcastle from Italy, making her a homeless orphan. Only vague memories of her place of birth remained, but they were ones of